In this video walkthrough, we're going to take a look at binding properties, and we're going to go ahead and create just a little sample here. This is going to be test bindings. I'm going to put this in my Scratch directory and create it. And the very first thing that we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and define a state property within our content view. And we'll just call this total clicks. And this is going to be an integer type, and we're going to set its initial value equal to 0. We've looked at the fact that with our state properties, we can use those to update our views with two-way binding. When there's an update to the actual value, then it's going to cause the view to update. One of the things that we get into, though, sometimes is when we have complex views, we want to start breaking down our views into additional files for simplicity purposes. And we're building essentially components that we're then utilizing from within our views to try to simplify our design. And it might be that we're reusing this functionality across multiple views, or it might be just something that it's so complex for a view that we want to break it down so it's easier to maintain. When we get into creating some of the components, if we had a value in our content view, for instance, or our main view that was going to be updated by a component view, we would be able to use our environment object, but what happens if we really don't want to add it to a class and kind of lug it around? Or we could potentially use a binding variable within our component view. And we're going to take a look at how that works. We go ahead and in our main view, we would add our state property. That's going to be something that we're going to link it to our binding property in our component view. Now, the binding is going to modify the state property in the content view as we go through this exercise. So keep that in mind. I'm going to start by removing the image here, and what I want to do is I want to update my text so that it says total clicks, and then it's going to show the value of the total clicks using string interpolation. And we see right now the value is 0. But if we were going to create some type of a component that's going to update this total clicks, and we're going to include that view within the context of this view, we are going to define a new file. And I'm just going to go up here and add a new file from template. This is going to be a Swift UI view, and I'm just going to call this some component view. And this is going to be super simple. It's not going to be too complex or anything like that. When we get into looking at it, the very first thing that we want to do is we want to create our binding, and we just basically are using our @ with the binding, and then we are defining the variable that we plan to link essentially the same way that we would our initial value. We don't give it an initialization value because that's taken care of here in where it's defined with the state, but I'm going to go ahead and come back to my sum view and then paste in the rest of this. Now, within the actual body of my view here, I want to add a button. And this button is essentially going to say, click me. Nothing too sophisticated here. And it's going to have an action where it's just going to go ahead and update the total clicks. And that's all it's really going to do. Now I should see that I have an issue here because I have a view that requires that since I haven't initialized it, that it needs to link this particular value to a binding variable that's being passed in. And so I need to come into my preview and I need to define an at previewable, and this is going to be state property, and this is going to be total clicks is equal to 0, and then I can go ahead and I can pass that in, and if I click here it's going to fix it and bring in that, and I can just go ahead and put in my binding variable here, which is total clicks. Now I can go ahead and if I want to fix up my button, because I actually like it where it looks like a button as opposed to just text here, I can always put the button style and make it the prominent, bordered prominent here, where it looks more like a button, and I could click it and it would update the total clicks. Now if I come into my content view, I'm going to see once I put this in, so I'm going to add my sum component view here, and it's going to force me to put in my total clicks, and I would be passing through my state value as a binding variable. And this is going to essentially connect the field here to the field here. So when I update this down here, it's going to then update this here. Now when I have a situation where I don't necessarily need to keep the data, and it's one of these things that I just want to go ahead and do some type of simple update like this, I can use a binding property for that instead of putting it into a class and using my environment object to keep track of it for me. Because in a lot of cases we want to retain that value, but if it's something really simple like a toggle value or something like that, we might not need to essentially lug that thing around to all of our different views with all of our different property values. You got to remember that when we're passing around things, the larger the size is, the performance is going to be a little less, and therefore we want to be able to put the things in the environment object that we really need to keep track of through multiple views, whereas in this case we don't really need to keep track of it beyond the two views where we have our content view and we have our sum component view. Now the way that this works is if I click it, now when I click it, it's updating in the sum component view, but it's going to reflect the change in the text here as we go through. So we can see that it's working now. So this is the whole concept of using binding properties. And the reason why we're going through some of the binding properties, we are next going to go through a rather complex example of how to build a more sophisticated like side menu that you see in mobile applications. And it's going to take into account not only Z-stacks, and it's also going to be using binding properties.